For centuries, Jews have been unfairly scapegoated for the ills of various societies. Before Hitler and the National Socialists blamed them for Germany's economic collapse, there was already a millennia-long history of hatred and exclusion. The Nazis didn't invent antisemitism, they inherited it. Since the Middle Ages, Jews have been blamed for epidemics like the Black Death, financial crises, and even natural disasters. And long before that, in the heart of the ancient world, the Romans already saw them as a threat to the imperial order, not because of their weapons or their armies, but because of their unwavering faith in one God. Men and gods, tensions between the Jews and ancient Rome. For centuries, the Jewish people lived in the region of Judea, a territory considered sacred by many. At the end of the 2nd century BC, Judea became a hotbed of geopolitical tensions. First under the rule of the Seleucid Empire and then with Rome's eastward expansion under the direct control of the Republic and later the Roman Empire. From the beginning, relations between Jews and Rome were marked by profound tension, based not only on political grounds but also on cultural and spiritual grounds. Judaism was a monotheistic religion that worshipped a single god exclusively. This contrasted sharply with Roman polytheism, which promoted the veneration of numerous gods and goddesses, as well as the emperor as a divine figure. The Romans were generally tolerant of local cults, as long as they did not question the authority of the empire or interfere in its governance. But the Jewish case was different. It was not simply a religion, but a worldview that organized the political, ethical, and social life of the entire community. Tensions worsened when Rome made Judea a Roman province in 6 AD, after the fall of the Hasmonean dynasty. The figure of Herod the Great, Rome's client king, had already generated strong internal controversies, but after his death, direct occupation by a Roman prefect brought with it a series of provocations. The collection of taxes, the presence of Roman symbols in Jerusalem, including banners with imperial images, and the corruption of officials exacerbated local resentment. In this context, several messianic movements began to emerge among the Jews. The concept of the Messiah, a liberating figure promised by Jewish tradition, became a symbol of resistance against Rome. One of the most notable cases was that of Jesus of Nazareth, whose execution by crucifixion, ordered by the prefect Pontius Pilate, was the result of both internal tensions within Judaism and Roman pressure to maintain order. The resistance took a more violent turn beginning in 66 AD, when the First Jewish-Roman War broke out. It was a massive revolt, driven by popular anger at the abuses of the Roman procurators, but also by a growing religious conviction that it was possible to expel the invader. At first, the rebels managed to take Jerusalem, and for a time it seemed that Rome would lose control. But in 70 AD, General Titus, son of Emperor Vespasian, retook the city in a brutal military campaign that culminated in the destruction of the Second Temple. This event marked a turning point not only politically, but spiritually. The Temple in Jerusalem was the heart of Judaism. Its destruction was not only a material catastrophe, but also a symbolic one. The center of the Jewish world was reduced to ruins. Many saw this as a definitive humiliation, and thousands were killed or sold into slavery. Later, Roman coins celebrated the victory with the inscription Judea Capta, Judea conquered, accompanied by an image of a chained Jewish woman. But the conflict did not end there. Decades later, between 132 and 135 AD, the Second Great Revolt broke out, the Bar Kokhba Rebellion. This time, the Jews were led by Simon Bar Kokhba, whom many considered the long-awaited Messiah. The revolt made significant progress in its early stages, and Jewish coins were even minted as a symbol of independence. However, Roman military power once again asserted itself with extreme violence. Emperor Hadrian, fed up with the uprisings in Judea, decided to apply an unprecedented punishment. Jerusalem was completely rebuilt as a Roman city bearing the name Aelia Capitolina. Jews were forbidden to enter the country under penalty of death. Furthermore, the name of the province of Judea was changed to Syria-Palestine in a symbolic attempt to erase the region's Jewish identity. These revolts and their repression had devastating consequences. Tens of thousands of Jews were killed, expelled, or sold into slavery to all corners of the empire. The Jewish diaspora consolidated, dispersing communities throughout Asia Minor, North Africa, and Europe. From then on, Judaism ceased to be a religion with a fixed geographical center and became a dispersed faith sustained by texts, rituals, and community ties. The relationship between Rome and the Jews from then on was marked by resentment, punishment, and suspicion. Although the Roman Empire kept other populations subservient for centuries, its attitude toward the Jews had a distinctive character. They were seen not only as a militarily defiant people, but as a community that resisted integration into the dominant culture. In a world that valued assimilation and imperial worship, the persistence of Judaism, its language, its customs, its diet, its laws, was considered a threat. This period between the 1st and 2nd centuries left a profound mark that would influence later centuries. The image of the rebellious, separatist Jew, an enemy of the imperial order, was beginning to consolidate itself as an archetype within the Western imagination. Although Roman hostility was largely a response to specific political and religious challenges, over time it gave way to a broader cultural vision, no longer based solely on specific conflicts, but on persistent prejudices. Antisemitism, as it is known today, had not yet been born. But the foundations were laid. The idea that the Jewish people were different, difficult to govern, incapable of integrating into the imperial order and deserving of suspicion or punishment, began to crystallize in these years. It was the beginning of a narrative that, albeit in different forms, would span time to reach tragic proportions centuries later. A new faith, the fall of Rome, and the rise of Christianity. Following the destruction of the Second Temple and the mass expulsion of the Jewish people from Jerusalem, the Roman Empire entered a period of territorial consolidation, but internally, the spiritual landscape began to transform. As the 1st century progressed and the 2nd century entered, a new faith, born precisely on Jewish soil, began to spread quietly: Christianity. Early Christianity emerged as a messianic Jewish movement. Its first followers, including the apostles, were Jews who believed that Jesus of Nazareth was the Messiah promised in the Hebrew Scriptures. During the first decades, the dividing line between Judaism and Christianity was blurred. They shared many customs, texts, and worldviews. In fact, in several synagogues across the empire, communities that were not yet clearly defined as separate coexisted. However, as the years passed, this relationship began to fracture. One of the main triggers was the decision of many Christians to open the faith to Gentiles, that is, to non-Jews. This openness entailed renouncing fundamental practices of Judaism, such as circumcision, dietary laws, and strict observance of the Sabbath. For Orthodox Jews, this was an unacceptable deviation. The Apostle Paul, in particular, was a central figure in this separation. Although he himself was a Jewish Pharisee, he actively preached among the Gentiles and defended the idea that salvation did not require following the Mosaic law, but simply having faith in Christ. This universalist vision of Christianity clashed head-on with Jewish identity based on the exclusive covenant with God and the fulfillment of the commandments. What began as a doctrinal difference gradually took on a more hostile tone. In some New Testament texts, written several decades after Jesus' death, there are references that reflect this tension. In the Gospel of John, for example, the Jews often appear as opponents of Jesus, even as responsible for his death. This narrative, although born of an internal dispute between groups, would become centuries later one of the ideological foundations of Christian antisemitism. Meanwhile, the Roman Empire viewed both Judaism and Christianity with growing distrust. Both religions were seen as exclusivist, poorly integrated into imperial culture, and dangerously defiant. But over time, Christianity gained followers, especially among the lower classes, slaves, and women. Its promise of universal redemption, its emphasis on eternal life and equality before God, resonated deeply in an unequal and decadent society. The Great Transformation came in the 4th century with the rise of Constantine. After a supposed divine vision before the Battle of the Milvian Bridge, Constantine converted to Christianity and in 313 signed the Edict of Milan, which guaranteed freedom of worship to Christians. Just a few decades later, Christianity would become the official religion of the Roman Empire, displacing traditional cults. This shift completely reshaped the map of spiritual power in Europe. From being persecuted, Christians came to occupy privileged positions, and in this process the young church, now supported by the state, began to define its identity vis-à-vis the others. The Jews, who until then had been religious adversaries on a horizontal level, became a minority group, singled out and vulnerable in a world that no longer understood them. In this context, the idea of the Jewish people as deicidal, that is, guilty of the death of Jesus, began to take hold. Although historically it was Rome that executed him, this accusation was strongly upheld for centuries. It was a theological interpretation that interpreted the destruction of the Second Temple and the dispersion as divine punishments for failing to recognize the Messiah. The Church Fathers, theologians such as Origen, John Chrysostom, and Augustine of Hippo, developed discourses that combined the need to tolerate Jewish existence as living proof of divine punishment with contempt for their beliefs and customs. In the words of John Chrysostom, one of the most influential preachers of the 4th century, the Jews are unworthy of indulgence and forgiveness. They dwell, as it were, in a theatre of infamy. Although these statements reflect the thinking of their time, their effects were lasting. The Church, instead of protecting the Jews as an ancient and respectable community, relegated them to a position of marginality and suspicion. As Christianity spread throughout Europe, the dominant culture became imbued with these prejudices. Jews were tolerated but never fully accepted. They were allowed to live, but under conditions that set them apart from others. They were forced to pay special taxes, live in separate neighborhoods, and wear distinctive clothing. In many cases, they were not allowed to participate in public life or hold positions of power. Despite all this, many Jewish communities managed to thrive, adapt, and resist. They preserved their language, their books, their festivals. Life in the diaspora was for centuries a combination of silent resistance and constant vulnerability. Jews lived knowing that the climate could change quickly, that a rumor, a false accusation, or a change of king could put their lives at risk. Triumphant Christianity not only inherited some of the Roman resentment toward Jews, but transformed it into a theological narrative. Instead of viewing them simply as a foreign people, they were presented as those who had betrayed the divine plan. This view, repeated from the pulpits for generations, sowed a hostility that did not respond to concrete facts, but to a symbolic construction. Thus, the separation between Christians and Jews, which at first was an internal divergence within Judaism, became a deep fracture. And over time, that fracture turned into persecution. Systematic violence against Jews had not yet begun in its most brutal form, but the seeds of prejudice were already sown. The end of the Western Roman Empire in 476 brought no relief. On the contrary, the Christian kingdoms that emerged after its fall continued that legacy, now without the counterweight of a central power. Antisemitism ceased to be merely a religious issue and began to take on social, legal, and political forms. But that will be the subject of the next chapter. The fallen empire, the persecution of Jews, and prohibitions during Constantinople. When the Western Roman Empire fell in 476, the history of antisemitism was not interrupted. It merely changed form. While Western Europe fragmented into Germanic kingdoms, the Eastern Roman Empire, known as the Byzantine Empire, consolidated its power around its new capital, Constantinople. There, under the banner of Orthodox Christianity, new forms of discrimination and repression toward Jewish communities developed. Constantinople was a magnificent city. Founded by Constantine on the ruins of Byzantium, it was destined to be the new Rome, the political, religious, and cultural center of an empire that would last for almost 1,000 years. But it was also the setting where a profoundly exclusionary religious policy toward Jews was first institutionalized, led by the Eastern Orthodox Church and validated by the imperial power. From the earliest centuries, Byzantine emperors began issuing edicts restricting Jewish life. One of the most significant was that of Emperor Theodosius II in the 5th century, who prohibited Jews from building new synagogues or repairing existing ones. He also prohibited them from holding public office, teaching Christians, or performing conversions. These decrees did not arise in a vacuum. They were promoted and justified by the bishopric, which already considered Jews not only as heretics, but as enemies of the faith. By this point, religious discourse had settled on a paradigm that would be recurrent for centuries. Jews were considered eternally guilty of the death of Christ, and their presence among Christians was to serve as a living example of their supposed curse. They were not to be exterminated, that was theologically unacceptable, but they were to be kept in humiliation, subordination, and disrepute. This logic allowed for forced coexistence, but also legitimized systematic marginalization. A clear example of this mentality is found in the homilies of St. John Chrysostom, Archbishop of Constantinople at the end of the 4th century. His sermons were incendiary. He accused Jews of being Christ killers, beasts, and demons. Although these speeches were intended in part to prevent Christians from attending Jewish festivals, something that frequently happened in practice anyway, his words fueled a collective imagination of hatred that lasted well beyond his time. The clergy's pressure on political power intensified over the centuries. Bishops not only wielded spiritual influence but also became figures of territorial power. They controlled cities, organized armies, and issued laws. And in many cases, they directly instigated violence against Jews. Under the guise of doctrinal purity, physical attacks, the looting of synagogues, forced conversions, and the confiscation of property were justified. One of the most illustrative episodes was the destruction of synagogues in various cities of the empire, such as Antioch during the 6th century under Emperor Justinian. This emperor, remembered for his famous Corpus Juris Civilis, was also responsible for toughening laws against Jews. He forbade them from reading the Torah in Hebrew, forcing them to do so in Greek, closed rabbinical schools, and promoted conversion campaigns under threat of losing civil rights. The figure of the Byzantine emperor was a blend of political and theological authority. He was seen as God's representative on earth, which meant his will was also considered divine will. Therefore, imperial decisions on religious matters were rigorously applied and with deep ideological backing. For Jews, this meant living in a system that did not consider them full citizens, but rather subjects tolerated under certain conditions. The problem worsened with forced conversions. Although Christianity, in theory, was supposed to be based on the free acceptance of the faith, in practice, many Jews were forced to be baptized. While some accepted as a means of survival, others resisted, often paying the price with exile, imprisonment, or death. Even those who converted were not always accepted as true Christians. They were monitored, their faith questioned, and they were often referred to as conversos Judeos. In addition to state repression, social tensions were constant. Orthodox Christianity promoted the idea of a spiritual unity in which all non-Christianity was suspect. In that environment, Jews were easily scapegoated whenever an economic crisis, famine, or epidemic occurred. Spontaneous violence, such as lynchings or house burnings, was rarely punished and often even encouraged by the local clergy. Despite all this, Jewish communities found ways to adapt. In cities like Thessalonica, Smyrna, and Alexandria, they maintained trade networks, studied in secret, and preserved their customs. Byzantine Judaism developed its own characteristics, influenced by the Greek language and Christian liturgy, but always under the weight of surveillance and legal inferiority. What was experienced in Constantinople and its provinces was not modern antisemitism in the racial sense. It was a theological, institutional hatred, deeply tied to the medieval Christian worldview. But its consequences were real: exclusion, impoverishment, persecution. This type of antisemitism was not limited to the Byzantine sphere, although in different forms it was also replicated in the West, where Latin Catholicism followed a similar path. In both cases, the figure of the bishop, whether Orthodox or Catholic, operated not only as a spiritual guide but also as a political and social agent. And his stance toward Jews set the tone for local communities. In the Christian East, antisemitism was persistent, although more regulated. Outright extermination was not always advocated, but efforts were systematically made to erode Jewish life. The idea was for Jews to survive, but in a condition of subordination, as perpetual witnesses to the failure of their faith. This profoundly cruel logic would survive for centuries, and even influence the legislation of later Christian Europe. The Byzantine Empire, which lasted until the fall of Constantinople in 1453, left an ambivalent legacy: a sophisticated culture, brilliant art, a complex theology, and a legal and doctrinal structure that institutionalized contempt for Jews. This model, to a greater or lesser extent, would be replicated by many of the Christian kingdoms of Europe during the Middle Ages, and in every corner where Christianity became a power. The Jews, meanwhile, continued to disperse. As pressure intensified in the Christian East, many sought refuge in other lands, to North Africa, to Persia, to the Iberian Peninsula. But this journey was no guarantee of peace. In each new destination, a different reality awaited them, but almost always under the same shadow, that of prejudice and exclusion. New exile, the flight of Jews to Eastern Europe, the French region, and the Middle East. The history of the Jewish people, from ancient times to the present day, has been a constant search for refuge, survival, and belonging. After centuries of persecution under the Roman and Byzantine regimes, many communities began to emigrate in search of places where their faith could be kept alive, where their children could grow up without fear, and where Jewish knowledge, represented in the Torah, the Talmud, and Halakha, would not be condemned but preserved. During the 6th to 10th centuries, the paths of the diaspora diversified. Some Jewish communities residing in the east, what are now parts of Syria, Lebanon, Iraq, and Iran, settled in cities with a tradition of relative tolerance, such as Baghdad, Damascus, and Isfahan. In these areas, under Muslim rule, they found a coexistence that, although not without its difficulties, was in many ways less oppressive than the one they experienced under the Christian Byzantine Empire. Islam, in its legal structure, considered Jews and Christians as people of the book, that is, holders of a revealed faith. Although they were given a subordinate status, known as dhimmi, and required to pay special taxes, they had the right to practice their religion, maintain their internal laws, and live in autonomous communities. This situation allowed the flourishing of great centers of Jewish study, such as the Talmudic Academy of Sura, and figures like Saadia Gaon and Maimonides, who developed fundamental works in philosophy, law, and science. Meanwhile, on the other side of the Mediterranean, the Iberian Peninsula was becoming another key destination for the diaspora. In the Muslim-dominated south, the region of Al-Andalus, Jews found a space where, for several centuries, they could integrate into cultural, economic, and scientific life. They participated in the translation of Greek texts, were doctors, astronomers, and administrators. The Golden Age of Sephardic Judaism, as it is known, was a shining exception in a history marked by persecution. However, the largest destination of this new diaspora was Eastern Europe. In what we now know as Ukraine, Poland, Lithuania, and Belarus, Jewish communities expelled or marginalized from other regions began to settle, partly because these lands were less politically organized, and partly because feudal lords saw in the Jews an opportunity to develop trade, tax collection, and resource management. In this new context, Ashkenazi Jews, as those who settled in Eastern Europe would be called, began to develop their own cultural and religious identity. Their language, Yiddish, was a blend of German, Hebrew, and Slavic languages. Their communal traditions, their rabbinical schools, their festivals, all took on a unique character. They lived in shtetls, small Jewish villages or neighborhoods, where they maintained a closed community life, organized around the synagogue, the mikveh, and the market. But this relative stability was not free from threats. Although many Jews were initially welcomed, their economic success or their role in tax administration aroused resentment. They were often seen as intermediaries between the nobility and the peasants, making them easy targets for popular anger. When there were poor harvests, disease, or rebellions, pogroms, violent attacks on Jewish communities became frequent. The violence, although episodic, was beginning to take organized form. Meanwhile, in Western Europe, especially in what is now France and Germany, Jews lived in an ambiguous situation. On the one hand, they were necessary for the development of finance and trade, especially in the expanding cities of the Middle Ages. On the other hand, they were constantly subject to religious and social prejudice. The Catholic Church maintained its rhetoric against Judaism, and many bishops and preachers fostered false ideas about alleged ritual crimes, host desecration, or secret conspiracies. In France, for example, kings granted letters of protection to Jews, allowing them to live in certain cities in exchange for tribute. But these protections were fragile and could be revoked at any time. Under the reign of Philip Augustus in 1182, Jews were expelled from Paris and their property confiscated. Decades later, they would be readmitted, but the same dynamic would be repeated in different kingdoms and under different pretexts. Despite everything, many Jews successfully settled in cities such as Narbonne, Marseille, and Bordeaux, where Jewish communities had existed since Roman times. In these regions, Jewish life found spaces to flourish, albeit always under the shadow of political and religious instability. Knowledge of Hebrew, accounting techniques, medicine, and trade often meant that Jews were viewed with suspicion by sectors that did not understand their culture or considered them unfair competition. This period also saw the rise of blood libels, a particularly cruel form of antisemitism. These false accusations that Jews kidnapped and murdered Christian children to use their blood in religious rituals. These baseless slanders were propagated by medieval preachers and chroniclers and led to brutal persecutions, lynchings, and summary executions. A single accusation was enough for an entire community to be burned to the ground. In many cases, Jews had to flee with only their clothes. They dispersed to more peripheral regions, once again seeking refuge. Each generation seemed to repeat the history of the previous one, finding a place to settle, building synagogues, schools, and cemeteries, only to see it razed decades later. Despite all this, the cultural legacy that Jews left in Eastern Europe and in regions like France and the Middle East was profound. Not only did they contribute to the economic and cultural development of many cities, but they also preserved a millennia-old religious tradition in the face of constant hostility. Their music, their literature, their philosophical and rabbinic thought survived, even in adverse conditions. Each migration left its mark. Books written in Spain reached Constantinople. Songs from North Africa were sung on the Danube. Families expelled from France reunited with others in Prague or Vilnius. Judaism survived not thanks to power, but to memory, oral transmission, and adaptability. In a world that frequently changed masters, laws, and languages, the Jewish people held on to their own like an invisible thread that tied them to their past and gave meaning to their present. That thread, however, did not protect them from hatred. In the centuries to come, hostility would intensify. The Crusades, the epidemics, the religious wars. Every crisis in Europe would be a new excuse to point the finger at the Jews as responsible for all evil. But for now, in this period of flight and reconstruction, what prevailed was the hope of finding, in some corner of Europe or the Muslim world, a place where one could simply live. The Crusades, the dispute over Jerusalem between Arabs, Jews, and Catholics. At the end of the 11th century, Europe was experiencing a spiritual and political turmoil that would unleash one of the most violent eras for the Jewish people, the Crusades. What on paper was presented as a sacred undertaking to liberate the holy places of Christianity from the hands of Muslims, in practice also transformed into a massacre of Jews in Europe and the Middle East. The cross, a symbol of redemption, became a sword. It all began with the call of Pope Urban II in 1095, during the Council of Clermont. In a context of conflict between Western and Eastern Christianity, and with the Muslim threat growing in the Holy Land, the pontiff urged European Christians to take up arms and undertake an armed pilgrimage to Jerusalem. What promised total forgiveness for sins became a crusade of faith, but also of blood. Before even reaching the Holy Land, the Crusades began their campaigns of violence within Europe. In the Rhineland regions of Mainz, Worms, and Speyer, in present-day Germany, thousands of Jews were attacked, murdered, or forced to convert to Christianity. It was one of the first organized anti-Jewish massacres in Western Europe. The justifications were religious, but also economic. Many crusaders were in debt to Jewish moneylenders. Killing their creditors, destroying records, and looting their homes became an easy way to finance the divine expedition. In Mainz, for example, nearly 1,000 Jews were murdered in May 1096. In some cases, church authorities themselves tried unsuccessfully to stop the massacres. Popular fury, fueled by centuries of prejudice, was unstoppable. Christian chroniclers of the time recount these massacres with a certain admiration. But Jewish chronicles, such as the Chronicle of the Righteous of Worms, describe scenes of entire families choosing suicide over forced conversion. Men who slit the throats of their own children to spare them humiliation. Mothers who threw themselves into fires, clutching their babies. Fidelity to the faith, even in the face of death, became the only consolation. Finally, the Crusaders reached the Holy Land. But there, the violence did not abate. When Jerusalem was taken in 1099, the Christian army carried out a brutal massacre against the Muslim population and against the Jews as well. It is estimated that the entire Jewish community of Jerusalem was exterminated in just a few days. Many were burned alive inside their synagogues. There was no distinction between faith or age. Children, rabbis, merchants, all were considered enemies. This conquest marked a new turning point in the history of the Holy City. Jerusalem, the center of Jewish spirituality since biblical times, now became a war prize for Christianity. The Muslims, who had controlled the city since the 7th century, were expelled, and the Jews, who had lived under the Muslim yoke but with a certain tolerance, were physically eliminated. The Holy City became a battlefield, a symbol of eternal dispute between religions that shared much more than they cared to admit. For almost a century, Jerusalem remained under Christian control. The founding of the Kingdom of Jerusalem was seen in Europe as a sign of divine favor. But for the Muslims of the region, and also for the surviving Jewish communities in nearby cities like Hebron and Tiberias, it was a tragedy that marked the beginning of centuries of conflict. The Latin presence in the Holy Land was seen as an invasion, not only military, but also cultural and spiritual. The Jews who managed to survive in the region during the Crusade period lived under inhumane conditions. They were forbidden to live in Jerusalem, practice their religion publicly, or trade freely. Those who were not killed or expelled had to hide their faith or resign themselves to humiliation. The Jerusalem synagogue was converted into a church, and the Jewish cemeteries were desecrated or destroyed. Despite this repression, the hope of returning to Jerusalem never disappeared. In daily prayers, on every festival, the yearning to return to Zion and rebuild the temple remained the spiritual core of Judaism. Even in the most remote places of the diaspora, Jews turned toward Jerusalem in prayer, remembering that their history was not over, even if their present was bleak. The Second Crusade in 1147 and the Third Crusade in 1189 only renewed these tensions. Although its main focus was the fight against Muslims, pogroms against Jews were repeated in many regions of Europe. It was as if each crusade was inevitably accompanied by a new wave of bloodshed. But the Muslims would not remain passive. In 1187, Sultan Saladin reconquered Jerusalem after defeating the Christian forces at the Battle of the Horns of Hattin. Unlike the Crusaders, Saladin allowed the Jews to return to the city. Under his rule, albeit with restrictions, the Jewish presence in the Holy Land was restored. The community once again had synagogues, schools, and cemeteries. The city was once again plural, albeit under Islamic control. However, the conflict over Jerusalem had already established itself as a global issue. It was not just a city, it was a symbol. For Christians, it was the place where Christ had been crucified and resurrected. For Jews, it was the spiritual heart of their people and the promise of redemption. For Muslims, the place from which Muhammad ascended to heaven and one of the 3 sacred centers of Islam. 3 religions, 1 city, endless wounds. The Crusades, far from being an exception in European history, set a standard. Religion became an excuse to justify plunder, violence, and exclusion, and antisemitism, already present in sermons and laws, took on a new dimension, that of extermination justified by faith. In this context, Jews were not seen as human beings, but as obstacles in the struggle for divine truth. On a symbolic level, the Crusades served to consolidate an image of the Jew as an eternal enemy, both in Europe and in the Holy Land, an enemy to be expelled, converted, or eliminated. This narrative would be repeated with variations for centuries in expulsions, inquisitions, ghettos, pogroms, until reaching the extermination camps of the 20th century. But even in the darkest times, Jewish life persisted. In Jerusalem, Safed, Cairo, and Toledo. In every corner where a family lit Shabbat candles, where a rabbi hand-copied the Talmud, where a child learned to recite the Shema, the history of the Jewish people was rewritten once again. The other plague, antisemitism during the Great Plagues of the 14th century and the massacre of 1349. The 14th century was a time of darkness in Europe, an era marked by economic collapse, famine, war, and above all by an unprecedented health tragedy, the Black Death. Between 1347 and 1351, this disease devastated the continent. An estimated 1/3 of Europe's population, some 25 million people, died in less than 5 years. It was impossible to understand its origin, its speed, its cruelty. And in this void of knowledge, fear became fertile ground for hatred. The plague did not discriminate. It killed nobles and peasants, religious and lay people, children and the elderly. But when the horror became unbearable, humankind did what it has done so many times throughout history: look for someone to blame. And Europe's oldest scapegoat, once again, was the Jewish people. From the first outbreaks of the plague in Italy, rumors began to spread that Jews were responsible for the disease. How? By poisoning wells, it was said. This completely unfounded accusation spread with a speed comparable to that of the plague itself, and along the way it generated panic, lynchings and mass killings in dozens of cities and towns. Why the Jews? Because they were already different, because they spoke another language, prayed to a different God, lived in separate neighborhoods, because they were marked by centuries of laws, images and discourses that branded them as heretics, traitors, murderers of Christ. The accusation of well poisoning was the culmination of centuries of accumulated prejudice. All it took was for a child to die suddenly, for an outbreak to appear in a Christian neighborhood, for the mob to turn against the local Jews. Pogroms, that is, anti-Jewish massacres, broke out with fury. In Basel, Switzerland, the entire community was arrested. More than 600 men, women and children were locked in a wooden building which was then set on fire. No one came out alive. The city, moreover, prohibited the presence of Jews for more than 2 centuries. In Strasbourg, where the plague had not yet arrived, rumors sufficed. On February 14, 1349, more than 900 Jews were burned alive in the public square. In Cologne, Mainz, Erfurt, Worms, Frankfurt, and dozens of other cities in the Holy Roman Empire, the scene was repeated with variations. Synagogues were looted, Torah scrolls burned, cemeteries desecrated. Many communities were completely exterminated. Some people tried to resist, others fled or committed suicide rather than fall into the hands of the mob. There was no trial, no law, and no protection. In some cases, local authorities attempted to curb the violence. Some cities issued decrees to protect their Jewish communities, reminding everyone that there was no evidence of their involvement in the spread of the plague. Even Pope Clement VI issued 2 papal bulls condemning the attacks and recalling that the disease was natural, not man-made. But his words came too late, or were ignored entirely. The fact that in some regions Jewish communities seemed to suffer less from contagion only fueled the myth. But the explanation was much simpler. Jews, out of religious custom, washed their hands regularly, followed dietary and hygiene rules, and often lived in closed neighborhoods that limited outside contact. These practices, far from protecting them, became suspect. The massacre of 1349 marked a turning point in the history of medieval antisemitism. It was no longer just legal discrimination or symbolic hostility. It was a massive, organized, physical extermination. And what's even more serious is that it could only have been possible with the participation or complicity of the neighbors themselves. People who shared the street, the market, the language. People who just the day before had bought bread at the same store were now burning alive those they considered responsible for divine retribution. In historical terms, this wave of violence had irreparable consequences. Dozens of Jewish communities in the heart of Europe were wiped off the map. Central European Jewry entered into crisis. Many survivors fled eastward, seeking refuge in Poland and Lithuania, where King Jagiellon and King Casimir III offered protection in exchange for commercial and administrative services. Thus began a mass migration that would change the face of the diaspora. This flight to the east turned Eastern Europe into the new epicenter of Ashkenazi Judaism. There, for centuries, a vibrant Jewish life would develop, with centers of study, music, literature, and mysticism. But it also presented new dangers, because the hatred that had erupted with the plague didn't disappear. It only changed form, location, and excuse. The Black Death left deep scars, not only on European demographics, but also on its collective consciousness. Many survivors believed they had experienced the end of the world. The trauma was so great that a narrative was needed, an explanation, and for a Christian Europe accustomed to seeing the Jew as the other, that explanation was easy to find. From then on, crises, whether plagues, wars, or economic collapses, tended to be accompanied by new waves of antisemitism. The idea that the Jew was the cause of the world's ills became entrenched as a cultural reflex, and that reflex, once activated, could justify any atrocity. The most disturbing thing about the 1349 massacre is not only the scale of the violence, but its spontaneity. It wasn't ordered from a throne or a pulpit, although it was often encouraged from there. It was popular, it was neighborly, it was the product of centuries of prejudice, legitimized by an entire culture. The Jews survived once again, but the price was extremely high, not just in lives, but in trust in each other, in the possibility of coexistence. From then on, many communities became more closed, more suspicious, more isolated. It was a form of protection, and at the same time, that difference fueled new suspicions. Thus, the wheel of hatred kept turning, driven by ignorance, by fear, by the need to find someone to blame. And the Jews, for centuries, were caught in that gear. Near the Revolution, the situation of Jews at the end of the 19th century, and the emergence of eugenic ideas. The modern age, which began in the late 15th century with European expansion and the rise of nation-states, represented a profound change in world history. For Jews, this period was ambiguous. On the one hand, it meant continued exile, marginalization, and expulsion. But it also laid the groundwork for their progressive emancipation, especially toward the 19th century, when some regimes began to recognize their civil rights. However, this process was not linear. It was full of setbacks, new forms of hatred, and a subtle but dangerous transformation, the shift from religious antisemitism to pseudoscientific antisemitism. At the end of the 15th century, the Catholic kingdoms of Europe dealt the hardest blows. In 1492, the Catholic monarchs expelled the Jews from Spain, and 4 years later, Portugal did the same. Many Jews sought refuge in the Ottoman Empire, where they found a degree of tolerance, especially in cities like Thessaloniki, Istanbul, and Sarajevo. Others went to Morocco, Italy, or the Netherlands. Thus were born the Sephardic Jews, descendants of those expelled from the Iberian Peninsula, who developed their own identity, with their own language, traditions, and rites. Meanwhile, Central and Eastern Europe remained a complex refuge. Poland and Lithuania offered relative religious freedom, and Jewish communities flourished in their cities, fostering an intense intellectual life with yeshivot, rabbinical schools, synagogues, and a robust trade network. But this peace was fragile. In the 17th century, for example, Bohdan Khmelnytsky's Cossacks carried out a series of massacres in Ukraine and Poland, murdering tens of thousands of Jews in a brutal campaign in which religious hatred mingled with nationalist violence. Meanwhile, in Western Europe, the map was being reordered. With the Protestant Reformation, some regions distanced themselves from Catholicism, and although Martin Luther initially expressed sympathy for Jews, he later adopted a violent and anti-Semitic stance. In his work On the Jews and Their Lies, written in 1543, he called for burning synagogues, destroying houses, and banning rabbis from teaching. This text, ignored for centuries, would be revived in the 20th century by the Nazis as part of their ideological justification. In the 18th century, the Age of Enlightenment brought new ideas about liberty, equality, and human rights. Thinkers such as Voltaire, Montesquieu, and Rousseau promoted the idea of a society based on reason, not faith. But even among the Enlightenment, Jews were still viewed with suspicion. They were considered a closed, superstitious people, incapable of integration. The Enlightenment proposed their improvement, their transformation into modern citizens, but often on the condition that they renounce their religious or cultural identity. The great promise of emancipation came with the French Revolution. In 1791, the National Assembly granted Jews full civil and political rights, making them French citizens. It was the first time in modern history that a state recognized Jews as equals before the law. This marked a milestone. Soon, other countries began to imitate this model, at least in theory. During the 19th century, especially in Western Europe, Jews began to integrate into public life. Some became influential bankers, doctors, lawyers, and professors. In Germany and Austria, universities opened their doors. In France, Judaism was reorganized as a state-recognized religion, like Catholicism or Protestantism. This was the birth of Reform Judaism, a movement that sought to adapt traditional practices to modern life, but this integration, although real, generated new resentments. In many cities, the presence of Jews in liberal professions, the press, or commerce was viewed as a threat by conservative and nationalist sectors. Antisemitism was no longer expressed so much in religious terms, but rather as a matter of undue influence and penetration of economic power. The idea of the Jew as an internal enemy began to take shape. Added to this was an even more sinister phenomenon, the emergence of scientific racism and eugenic ideas. In the context of social Darwinism and the rise of 19th-century biological theories, pseudosciences emerged that attempted to classify and rank human races. There was talk of superior and inferior races, of blood purity, of physical characteristics linked to moral character. And in this framework, Jews were transformed into a separate race. Authors such as Arthur de Gobineau, Houston Stewart Chamberlain, and other German nationalist ideologues began to speak of the degeneration of Europe due to intermingling with non-Aryan races. Antisemitism was no longer a matter of belief, it was now biological. Even if a Jew converted to Christianity, even if he adopted the language and customs of the country where he lived, he was still Jewish by blood. This logic distanced itself from religion and opened the door to what would later become the genocidal racism of the 20th century. The Dreyfus Affair in France in 1894 revealed the deep-rooted nature of modern antisemitism. Alfred Dreyfus, a Jewish officer in the French army, was falsely accused of treason. The scandal divided the entire country, and although he was ultimately exonerated, the trial demonstrated the power of anti-Semitic rhetoric in military, political, and media circles. It was in this context that Theodor Herzl, an Austrian Jewish journalist covering the trial, concluded that assimilation was not enough, that Jews, even integrated, would continue to be seen as outsiders, and that the only solution was the creation of a Jewish state. Thus, the idea of political Zionism was born amid a century of promises of equality that collided with the reality of renewed anti-Semitism. Herzl was not alone. At the end of the 19th century, in Eastern Europe, millions of Jews lived in conditions of extreme poverty under governments that tolerated or even promoted periodic pogroms. Russia, in particular, lived under an openly anti-Semitic regime where Jews were forced to live in demarcated areas with restricted access to education and under constant police surveillance. Thousands of Jewish families began to emigrate. Between 1880 and 1920, more than 2 million Jews fled to the United States, seeking a better life away from violence and discrimination. At the same time, others began emigrating to Palestine, then under Ottoman rule, purchasing land, organizing agricultural colonies, and laying the foundations for the future state of Israel. Modern times, anti-Semitism in Europe, the United States, and Latin America at the beginning of the 20th century. The 20th century opened with promises of progress, science, modernity, and freedom. But those same lights cast deep shadows. In many corners of the world, anti-Semitism, far from having disappeared with the advance of reason, had transformed, adapted, and institutionalized. The old religious myths of the Jewish deicide or the usurer gave way to a new discourse, that of the Jewish conspirator, the internal enemy, the invisible invader. This narrative, fueled by emerging nationalisms and social crises, would find echoes not only in Europe but also in the Americas. In the years leading up to the First World War, Europe was already experiencing a wave of modern anti-Semitism. In Germany and Austria, nationalist parties were beginning to openly use hatred of Jews as an electoral tool. In Russia, the Tsarist regime promoted, tolerated, or outright organized violent pogroms, aiming to channel popular discontent toward minorities. One of the most shocking examples was the Kishinev pogrom of 1903, where dozens of Jews were murdered with complete impunity. Images of burned houses, raped women, and mutilated children spread around the world. In this context, a text appeared that would have disastrous consequences, the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. First published in Russia at the beginning of the 20th century, this false libel claimed that the Jews had a secret plan for world domination. Although it was a crude forgery, the text was reproduced and distributed throughout the continent and later in America as if it were a revealed truth. It became the manual of modern anti-Semitism, cited by politicians, priests, journalists, and academics seeking to justify exclusion and persecution. The First World War brought no relief, on the contrary. With the fall of the great empires, Europe was filled with new nation-states that viewed ethnic and religious minorities as threats to their identity. In Poland, Hungary, Ukraine, Romania, and other countries, new waves of violence against Jews occurred. In Ukraine, between 1918 and 1921, during the civil war following the Bolshevik Revolution, it is estimated that more than 100,000 Jews were murdered in pogroms organized by forces of various stripes, nationalists, Tsarists, even sectors of the White Army. In Germany, the situation was even more complex. After losing the war, the country was humiliated by the Treaty of Versailles, hit by inflation, and fractured by political instability. In this breeding ground, conspiracy theories began to spread according to which Jews had stabbed the country in the back, facilitating its defeat. They were accused of controlling banking, commerce, the press, communism, and capitalism all at once. It was an irrational hatred, but an effective one, and it found fertile ground in a population desperate to find culprits. Meanwhile, in the United States, antisemitism took on its own forms. Despite being a country of immigrants, the growth of the Jewish population, especially of Russian and Polish origin, generated social tensions. In the 1920s, organizations like the Ku Klux Klan began to direct their hatred toward Jews, as well as African Americans and Catholics. At many elite universities, such as Harvard and Yale, invisible quotas were implemented to limit the number of Jewish students, and in residential areas, clauses were enforced prohibiting the sale of homes to Jewish families. Automobile magnate Henry Ford was one of the main promoters of anti-Semitism in the United States. In his newspaper, the Dearborn Independent, he published anti-Jewish articles for years based on the Protocols of Zion. He even compiled them into a widely circulated book titled The International Jew. Hitler would later praise him in Mein Kampf. And although Ford publicly apologized years later, the damage had already been done, as he had helped establish anti-Semitism at the very heart of the American dream. In Latin America, the situation was different. In Argentina, Brazil, Mexico, and other countries, there were significant waves of Jewish immigration during the first decades of the 20th century, mainly from Eastern Europe. They were escaping hunger, anti-Semitism, and war. In general, they were welcomed as laborers and drivers of trade, but they also faced social, cultural, and political barriers. In Argentina, for example, the conservative newspaper La Fronda promoted an anti-Semitic view, linking Jewish immigrants with communism, usury, and prostitution. During the so-called Tragic Week of 1919, a pogrom broke out in the once neighborhood in Buenos Aires. Mobs attacked Jewish businesses and homes, shouting, "Death to the Russians and the Jews." Although the episode was quickly silenced by the official press, it remained etched in the collective memory of the Argentine Jewish community. In Brazil, during Getúlio Vargas's Estado Novo regime, Jewish immigration was restricted, especially during the 1930s, for fear of undesirable elements amid growing sympathy for fascism. And in countries like Mexico and Chile, although there was partial integration, nationalist discourses also emerged that viewed Jews as a threat to the local culture or the dominant Catholic identity. At the same time, many intellectual and artistic sectors began to react against this tide of hatred. Jewish writers, journalists, scientists, and activists actively participated in the progressive, socialist, and anarchist movements of the time. From working-class neighborhoods to universities, cultural associations, unions, publishing houses, and newspapers in Yiddish, Hebrew, and Spanish were organized. Judaism was not only a religion or ancestry, it was also a cultural resistance, critical thinking, and an avant-garde movement. By 1935, the world was already dangerously inclined toward extremes. In Italy, Mussolini was consolidating fascism. In Germany, Hitler had been in power for 2 years and was beginning to implement laws that excluded Jews from public life. In France, the Action Française, a nationalist and anti-Semitic movement, was gaining strength. And in the United States, the Great Depression fueled the discourse of populist leaders who blamed Jewish bankers for the crisis. In this context, anti-Semitism was no longer a medieval remnant or a religious superstition. It was a political program, a modern ideology with its pamphlets, its radio stations, its editorials, its militias. It had ceased to be a prejudice and had become a tool of power. The Shoah, the rise of Nazism, and the brutal Holocaust. When Adolf Hitler came to power in Germany in January 1933, antisemitism was already deeply rooted in European culture. But what had once been social prejudices, legal exclusions, or episodic violence quickly became state policy. For the first time in modern history, a national government organized the persecution of a minority with scientific methods, bureaucratic structures, and mass support. Antisemitism ceased to be an ideology and was transformed into a propaganda machine of power. Nazi antisemitism was not improvised. Hitler had clearly articulated it in Mein Kampf, published in 1925. In its pages, Jews were portrayed as parasites, as responsible for Germany's defeat in World War I, as infiltrators of the economy, the press, and politics. Nazism was built on a narrative of racial purity that placed the German people, the Aryan race, as superior and the Jew as its absolute opposite. Barely in power, the regime began implementing laws to exclude Jews from public life. In April 1933, a boycott of Jewish businesses was decreed. That same year, Jews were expelled from academic, judicial, and administrative positions. In 1935, the Nuremberg laws officially stripped them of German citizenship, prohibited mixed marriages, and defined who was a Jew according to racial, not religious criteria. Faith no longer mattered, only blood. Propaganda played a pivotal role. Films, cartoons, textbooks, radio broadcasts, and even children's books portrayed Jews as a physical, moral, and cultural threat. They were compared to rats, diseases, and plagues. The regime's press, such as the infamous weekly Der Stürmer, reinforced these stereotypes weekly. Antisemitism was taught, celebrated, and institutionalized. With the annexation of Austria in 1938, the persecution intensified. And in November of that year, Kristallnacht, the Night of Broken Glass, marked a turning point. For 2 days, Nazi squads and German civilians destroyed more than 1,400 synagogues, looted thousands of businesses, and arrested more than 30,000 Jews, who were sent to concentration camps. The streets were covered in broken glass, but it wasn't just glass. It was the symbol of a society breaking down, leaving behind any semblance of legality. With the outbreak of World War II in 1939, the situation became even more brutal. The invasion of Poland brought more than 3 million Jews under Nazi control. They were forced to live in ghettos, neighborhoods enclosed by walls with military surveillance, chronic hunger, and disease. Whether in Warsaw, Lodz, or Krakow, every city had its ghetto. In some, people died at a rate of thousands per month. But the real turning point came in 1941 with the German invasion of the Soviet Union. In the East, the regime abandoned all restrictions. It began direct extermination. Einsatzgruppen, mobile murder units, roamed towns and cities, shooting entire Jewish communities. At Babi Yar, near Kyiv, more than 33,000 people were murdered in just 2 days. The victims dug their own graves. Then they were executed. This method, although effective for the regime's objectives, was considered inefficient and psychologically draining for the soldiers. Thus, the idea of an industrial system of death emerged. In January 1942, senior officials of the Third Reich met at the Wannsee Conference on the outskirts of Berlin. There, under an apparent bureaucratic formality, they organized what the Nazis called the final solution to the Jewish problem: the deportation and systematic extermination of all the Jews of Europe. The construction and expansion of the extermination camps then began: Auschwitz-Birkenau, Treblinka, Sobibor, Majdanek, Chelmno, and Belzec. Unlike concentration camps like Dachau and Buchenwald, these were centers designed solely for killing. Trains arrived loaded with men, women, and children. Many were tricked into believing they were going to shower. In reality, they entered gas chambers where they died from asphyxiation with Zyklon B. Their bodies were then cremated. The process was brutally efficient. At Auschwitz, up to 6,000 people could be murdered per day. The few prisoners left alive were forced to work sorting clothing, collecting gold teeth, and cleaning the ovens. It was a logic of total dehumanization. Every individual became a number, a file, a smokescreen. The complicity of the state apparatus was absolute. Civil servants, engineers, doctors, accountants, private companies, everyone participated. The railway companies scheduled transport, construction companies designed crematoriums, banks managed confiscated assets. Death was part of the system, a cold, organized, modern system. The Holocaust wasn't just a crime against Jews, it was a betrayal of the very idea of civilization. 6 million people were murdered. 1.5 million of them were children. The Jewish communities of Poland, Ukraine, Lithuania, Hungary, Germany, Czechoslovakia almost completely disappeared. No families, no synagogues, no languages remained, only ruins. And yet, even in that hell, there was resistance. Men and women who, without weapons or hope, wrote letters, preserved memories, hid others, rebelled in the ghettos, or simply decided to sing Kaddish aloud before dying. Every act of dignity was a victory against oblivion. The war ended in May 1945. The Allies liberated the camps and uncovered the horror. The survivors were living skeletons. The images traveled around the world. No one could believe it, but it had happened. And the most painful thing was that it hadn't happened in secret. It had been visible, allowed, tolerated for years. The Holocaust changed the history of humanity, not only because of its magnitude, but because of its message, that hatred can become law, that indifference can be complicit, that modernity does not guarantee humanity. For Jews, it represented a wound impossible to heal. For the world, a mirror impossible to ignore. But it also marked the beginning of a new era. Because after the catastrophe, the history of the Jewish people did not end. Rather, it found a place in the world to develop. The new home, creation of the State of Israel, and tensions with Arab countries. The end of World War II in 1945 left Europe in ruins. But for the Jewish people, it wasn't just about the physical reconstruction of cities, it was the need to find a new home. More than 6 million Jews had been murdered in the Holocaust. Those who survived wandered through displaced persons camps, without family, without possessions, without a homeland. Many were unwilling or unable to return to their homelands, where antisemitism still persisted. It was in this context that the idea of Zionism, born decades earlier, acquired a sense of historical urgency. The Zionist movement, officially founded by Theodor Herzl at the end of the 19th century, proposed the creation of a Jewish state in Palestine, a land with profound historical and religious significance. During the British Mandate over Palestine, which began after World War I, Jewish immigration had increased, especially following Nazi persecution. But Arab resistance had also grown. For the Muslim and Christian Palestinians living there, the massive arrival of European Jews was seen as a threat to their land, their identity, and their historic right to inhabit it. Between 1945 and 1947, international pressure to find a solution increased. The Allied powers, especially the United States, began to support the idea of a Jewish national home. The United Kingdom, exhausted by the war and increasingly unable to control the conflict between Arabs and Jews, decided to refer the issue to the newly created United Nations. On November 29, 1947, the UN voted in favor of the partition plan. It proposed dividing Palestine into 2 states, one Jewish and one Arab, with Jerusalem under international administration. Zionist leaders accepted the plan. Arab leaders rejected it. They considered it unfair as it gave the Jewish population, which was a very small minority at the time, a disproportionate share of the territory. Tensions escalated into violence. A civil war began between communities that already lived with mutual distrust. Attacks, assassinations, and reprisals were daily. And on May 14, 1948, one day before the British Mandate expired, David Ben-Gurion proclaimed the birth of the State of Israel. The declaration was greeted with jubilation by Jews who had survived the Holocaust and by thousands of communities in the diaspora. But the following day, 5 Arab countries, Egypt, Jordan, Syria, Lebanon, and Iraq, invaded the new state. Thus began the first Arab-Israeli war. Against all odds, Israel resisted and even expanded its territory beyond what was stipulated by the UN. For the Israelis, it was a heroic feat. For the Palestinians, it was a catastrophe, the Nakba, the disaster, which meant the expulsion or flight of more than 700,000 people, many of whom were never able to return. Since then, the history of the State of Israel has been marked by 2 major axes: its consolidation as a country and its conflict with the Arab world. In just a few years, Israel welcomed hundreds of thousands of Jewish immigrants from Eastern Europe, North Africa, Yemen, Iraq, Argentina, and Ethiopia. A modern state was built with democratic institutions, a powerful army, and an economy that over time became a world technological benchmark. But it was also built amid constant tension with its neighbors and with the Palestinian population who still lived and continue to live under occupation or as refugees. The Six-Day War in 1967 was another turning point. Israel defeated several Arab armies in just 1 week and occupied key territories: the Gaza Strip, the West Bank, East Jerusalem, the Golan Heights, and the Sinai. This victory, although celebrated within Israel, marked the beginning of the military occupation of millions of Palestinians. Since then, tensions have continued unabated. In 1973, during Yom Kippur, Egypt and Syria launched a surprise attack against Israel. Although they were repelled, the conflict once again demonstrated the region's fragility. Years later, with US mediation, Israel and Egypt signed a peace treaty in 1979. It was the first formal agreement between Israel and an Arab country. But the Israeli-Palestinian conflict persisted. The PLO, the Palestine Liberation Organization, founded in 1964, began to be recognized internationally as the voice of the Palestinian people. Its methods, which included terrorist attacks and kidnappings, were condemned, but its cause, the right to an independent state, gained strength. In 1987, the First Intifada, a popular rebellion in the occupied territories, broke out. In 1993, the Oslo Accords between Yasser Arafat and Yitzhak Rabin seemed to open the door to peace, but hope was short-lived. The agreement stalled, Rabin was assassinated by a Jewish extremist, and the process froze. In 2005, Israel unilaterally withdrew from the Gaza Strip, but shortly after, the Islamist group Hamas took control of the region. Since then, Gaza has been the scene of multiple wars, blockades, bombings, and a profound humanitarian crisis. Rockets fired by Hamas into Israeli territory and reprisals by the Israeli army have left thousands of civilians dead. Meanwhile, in the West Bank, Israeli settlement expansion continues, defying international law and making any two-state solution difficult. In parallel, the international community has attempted to mediate with little success. The United States, the European Union, the UN, the Arab League, all have promoted peace formulas that have failed. Meanwhile, entire generations of Israelis and Palestinians have grown up amid walls, checkpoints, air raid sirens, and pain. Fear, mistrust, and trauma prevent them from imagining a shared future. Today, more than 70 years after its founding, Israel is a country of great achievements and profound contradictions. It is a vibrant democracy for its Jewish citizens, but a military occupation for millions of Palestinians. It is a refuge for persecuted Jews, but also the epicenter of one of the longest-running conflicts of the 20th and 21st centuries. Antisemitism still exists around the world, in Europe, in America, in the Middle East. But there is also Islamophobia, racism, and xenophobia. And at the center of this intersection of hatred, of conflicting narratives, of legitimate grievances and intersecting violence are people, human beings, Jews, Palestinians, Arabs, Christians, all caught in a conflict that began more than a century ago, but whose roots, as we have seen, are much older. The history of antisemitism is also the history of intolerance. It is the history of fear of those who are different, of the manipulation of hatred, of the devastating consequences of dehumanizing the other. But it is also the history of a people who, despite centuries of persecution, chose to continue existing, reading, teaching, remembering, and dreaming.